understand is sharing with Deputy
sharing with Deputy Casey. I welcome the opportunity to contribute to this debate, and I'd like to thank Deputy Bruin, a former teacher of mine, for tabling the motion. However, that being said, it is disappointing, nearly 3 years after the election of the 32nd Dáil, to have to nearly 3 years after the election of the 32nd Dáil, an issue that dominated the very beginning of that Dáil, that the issue of housing and homelessness is as severe and as prominent today as it was 3 years ago. And while I acknowledge and Fianna Fáil will be supporting the principles of the motion in front of us today, I acknowledge there isn't one simple solution to this, but the motion specifically calls for an emergency to be declared and emergency actions to be taken. And they have to be taken, I suppose, in tandem with long-term structural changes needed in terms of the provision of significant additional housing. But the motion acknowledges the fact that we still have people who are homeless. The latest homeless figures that we were quoting are almost 10,000 people homeless. More than 3,500 of those are children. And we all know, as public reps, we're meeting them in their constituency offices, the challenging lives that those families are living, particularly with children. And it's whether they're in hotels trying to access cooking facilities and so forth, be driven to different areas to try and get to school. Their lives are hell at the moment. So those, and this figure has consistently stayed in or around the same number for a long, long time. And I think it's in that context that we need to look at some of the emergency measures. And I would just also allude to the fact that the figure for rough sleepers in recent times is quite high. I think the latest figure that we got was 156. But certainly, and I don't know where the count is, but certainly I'm seeing people sleeping rough in parts of Dublin that I never saw them before, on the canals, out on the M50, the N4, the N7 in tents and so forth. That is something that I've never seen before, and I don't even know if those people are included in that count, and I'd have serious concerns about that. The very first action in in rebuilding Ireland, which I've often said to you, Minister, and that's why I think emergency actions have to be taken in parallel with the structural changes. The first one was the Rapid Build programme, the Rapid Build housing. You committed to delivering 1,500 Rapid Build units by the end of 2018. My understanding is only a couple of hundred of those had been built. Can you imagine if the 1,500 had been delivered as was anticipated, as was supported by members on all sides in this House, if they had been delivered in a timely fashion? Think of the positive impact that would have on those people who are now homeless. Because Rapid Build was, as specifically stated in Rebuilding Ireland, to address the immediate need of homelessness. And I think that, it has been allowed slide and hasn't been addressed significantly. And the other issue that I've said to you before, Minister, and I say it again, is I'm disappointed when we drive around Dublin and we see the number of vacant houses, vacant properties, that the repair and leasing scheme is not returning the type of figures. Now, I don't know the answer to it, but I do think that in times of an emergency, that we should know why properties still remain vacant right around this city and its suburbs and are not being brought back into use. The figures, the Minister was talking about the social housing, the number of new builds for 2018 and how many were built, about 18,000 new houses, and over 4,000 of those were social houses. But I have one particular concern. And one of the deputies asked, well, how many of those were local authority? Only 2,022 houses were built by local authorities last year. And the reason I'm concerned about it, Minister, is traditionally it was local authorities who were the leaders in the provision of social housing. And yet for 2018, 2,022 is the total number of social houses built by local authorities in this country. 1,388 were provided by approved housing bodies and 840 from Part 5. So I think there needs to be a much clearer and a much clearer focus on the delivery of social houses through the local authority scheme. And certainly my conversations with people in the housing department and local authorities is they still are concerned at the process and the time that it takes. I do think, Minister, there is a piece of work to be done there. The Minister has spoken in his previous comments about HAP, and my concern is that, he talked about giving people choice and they can work and they can pick where they want to live and whatever. At the moment, there is an over-reliance on HAP, and HAP is certainly a very suitable payment for a short-term situation. But for somebody who wants to set down their life in a particular town or a particular community, or have young children and would envisage children staying in that community, going to the local primary school, progressing to the local secondary school, HAP doesn't afford that. The target, I think, the figures are in the programme, but the problem with HAP is, and Minister, you need to get to the bottom of this, in private rented accommodation, there is very, very significant churn. Not many people are staying 5 and 10 years. The people who are coming to our offices and who are homeless have all come through private rented accommodation. I'm not opposed to HAP, but what I am concerned of, there is an over-reliance on HAP. It is a short-term solution and it doesn't provide the long-term type of accommodation that it should. And in terms of private rented accommodation, I do recognise and appreciate there's a bill to come before the House. But I think the whole issue of a rent register, I was talking to Deputy O'Brien about a particular case, where we clearly know that the price of the property, when somebody vacated and was re-advertised and relet, went up significantly. So I think it's very, very important that that legislation in terms of a rent register, but I also think many people who are in private rented accommodation are in a vulnerable situation. There is such a scarcity of property out there, they're afraid to complain, and I believe the property inspections need to be ramped up. And I know, Minister, you're going to say year on year there's an increase, but the target is to get to 1 in 4 property inspections by 2021. I think that programme should, in my view, be accelerated. Minister, in your counter motion, I noted that you state a level of progress has been made is reflected in social housing waiting lists, which have reduced by 22% from 91,500 households to 71,885 or 858 between 2016 and 2018. And that may be statistically correct, but the problem is I'm meeting a significant number of people who don't qualify to go on social housing and have no prospect of buying a house of their own. They're caught in limbo. And I think it is about time that the income thresholds around social housing, and particularly in Dublin, where the cost of accommodation is so expensive, that the income thresholds be reviewed. And I think that's quite important, because we're certainly meeting a significant number of people who don't qualify for social housing and haven't a hope in hell of qualifying to get a mortgage to buy anything in the Greater Dublin area. Which makes me also come to the point that the whole area of affordable housing needs to be addressed. We have many, many cases, all of the members of this House will have many, many cases in a Dublin context, I can't speak for the rest of the country, where 2 people are working in a household and they have no chance of buying a house in Dublin, a house in a community where they may have lived all their life. And we need to look at introducing schemes. Now, the Minister may argue that, funding is available for infrastructure and that will reduce the cost of housing. It isn't significant enough. There are significant developments both under construction in South Dublin County Council and to be constructed in the future, and none of them offer meaningful affordable housing schemes. And there are a cohort of people that are left behind. And I think, Minister, that a number of things, apart from the cost of the house being reduced, some type of a saving schemes and recognition of the fact that they're paying a rent in relation to their ability to save a deposit. All of those things need to be considered. But there are certainly a group of people who are working in this country who don't qualify for social housing. And if we don't change and give them an opportunity to buy their own home, they will never have that opportunity. And in the absence, by the way, may I add, Minister, in the absence of a cost rental model, their rent will go up significantly over their lifetime. And finally, I just want to comment, because there's a lot of comment around the issue of the right to housing and from the point of view of whether we should make a constitutional or a legislative change. And, the Minister said it's being considered. 3 years ago, the Committee on Housing and Homelessness made a recommendation that an Oireachtas committee should address that issue as a matter of priority. And it's not some abstract or meaningful, or, just that it would be nice to have in the Constitution. it would be a counterbalance to existing property rights that are there. And I remember at one of the sessions of the committee, and I'll conclude on this, Lascan Corla, I remember at one of the sessions of the committee, quite specifically, we were talking about the vacant site levy and the purpose of it. And we were informed that because of the advice of the Attorney-General, the levy could only be introduced at a date in the future, could only be introduced at a certain rate. And the reason given was because there was, in the Constitution, a protection of property rights. There was no counterbalance in terms of a right to housing. And that, to me, was a real and tangible example of why a right to housing in the Constitution would be beneficial. I'll conclude at that point, Lascan Corra.